Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 133, Jake Daubert. He was a star first baseman for the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Cincinnati Reds during the early 1900s. Daubert was a student of the game. He flashed great leather at first base, and he was somewhat of a magician at the plate. In fact, he holds the record for most sacrificed bunts in a season, and he once had 6 in a doubleheader. He also stood up to ownership during a very pivotal time for Major League Baseball, and he earned the respect of his fellow ball players for doing so. We're going to cover a lot of that on today's episode. Of course, when he did this, he played for Brooklyn, and team owner Charles Ebbets was not very happy about this, and he traded Daubert away to Cincinnati. The trade actually worked out pretty well for Jake, as he helped lead the Reds to the National League pennant in 1919, and then he and the Reds took on the White Sox in the famous 1919 World Series, in which the Reds won. Joining me today to talk about Jake is Harry Deitz. Harry recently released a book about Jake, Gentleman Jake. Really good read. Before we get into today's discussion, please give Sports Forgotten Heroes a follow on X at SportsFHeroes, where I post daily about the forgotten heroes I cover. And follow on Facebook as well. Also, wherever it is you listen or watch, please follow, rate, and review. A 5-star rating, well, that's always nice to see. And as always, thanks for your support. Okay, so Jake Daubert. He broke in with Brooklyn in 1910 and finished his career 15 years later with Cincinnati with a lifetime batting average of .303. And here to tell us more about Jake is my guest, Harry Deitz. Harry, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you could join.
It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me, Warren.
Hey, so interesting topic today, Jake Daubert. Where does your interest in Jake come from?
Well, it started because Jake was born in my hometown of Shamokin, Pennsylvania. It started with a guy named Stan Kovaleski, a Hall of Famer, spitball pitcher from the deadball era. Stan was born in Shamokin, and I decided to write a book about him. And as I was researching it, I came across 4 other players who were born in Shamokin and played during the deadball era. Stan's brother, Harry, was another one. He's known as the Giant Killer. You may have heard of him. Back in the early 1900s, played for the Phillies and beat the Giants 3 times in 5 days, and they lost the pennant that year. He was pretty famous. He went on to have a pretty good career over a number of seasons with Detroit. 3 times he won 20 games or more with the Tigers. And there were a couple others, George Gillum, who played in 2 games over 2 years. And then the other one, the most interesting part of which is his name, Harry Budson Weiser, better known as Budweiser, who also played for the Phillies for parts of 2 seasons. But the most interesting one that I found outside of Stan was Jake. And as I started to look into his background and his what he accomplished in baseball, I was blown away, because he was, in my opinion, and I think it's hard to refute much of it, he was the best first baseman of the deadball era. So it's a shame that he didn't get as much attention as he should have. But there were a lot of reasons for that, which we can get into. But that was my interest in Jake, and the more I found out about him, the more I liked about him. Not only a great ball player, but an outstanding man of character.
Mm-hmm. We're going to concentrate a lot on his career, and we'll start with that. Who was Jake Daubert, and why is it important when talking baseball history? We know the name Jake Daubert.
Well, it's important because he was a two-time batting champion. He was one of the early MVPs, the original version of the MVP, the Chalmers Award, back in 1913. He was World Series champion with the Cincinnati Reds in 1919, that famous year. And he also uh, led the Brooklyn Robins to their first National League championship in 1916. Um, the guy had a career batting average over 15 seasons of 303 during the dead ball era. So, he was a pretty good hitter. Wasn't a home run hitter necessarily, although he did hit 56 home runs, a number of which were inside the Parkers. But his career stats are incredible.
Yeah, and he pretty much caught on right away, didn't he? His first year with Brooklyn, he played 144 games, hit 264, and then after that is when he really took off. Over the next 6 years, his average never fell under 300. And in 1913, like you said, he won the Chalmers Award. Tell us about his approach at the plate and what made him such a good hitter.
Well, Jake was a contact hitter. He was a slap hitter, a left-hander. He struck out very rarely. He was a great bunter. He often bunted with two strikes. And what he really was known for were the sacrifice hits that he made. He still holds the National League record to this day for career sacrifices. One day he had four sacrifices in a game, and that was his first game of a doubleheader. He had two in the second game, so he had six sacrifices that day. He was very good at moving runners. He used his speed. He usually batted second, and he was the kind of player that teams liked because he did what he could to help the team win.
He came up with Brooklyn in 1910 and he played through 1924. Like you said, he was a solid player, maybe the best first baseman of the dead ball era. So here's a very interesting question for you, and I don't know if you have an answer for this. He was really at the top of his game in 1913, 14, 15. Heck, you might even say he was as good as anybody in the game. At that time, however, baseball faced its stiffest competition ever from a competing league, the Federal League. Was Jake ever approached about joining the Federal League? Was he tempted to join the Federal League? What stopped him from jumping ship like so many other ball players did?
Well, Jake was approached by the Federal League, uh, by Pittsburgh, and he was offered a pretty hefty contract. I'm trying to remember what the numbers were. I think it was like 5 years and 30-some thousand dollars, which was a lot of money back then. Uh, and the word was that Jake was considering it. His wife even said something about Jake's got the contract in his pocket, but Jake had thought better of it. He didn't really want to, he still had a commitment to Brooklyn and he didn't want to jump ship. He didn't think it was the right thing to do. So he said, no, I really haven't seriously considered it. I'm going to stay with Brooklyn. And he did not jump like a number of others did. And he was rewarded for that with a 5-year contract from Brooklyn later that year. And that contract had a major impact on
Yeah.
Jake's career later on.
Yeah, we'll get into that, but first let's go back to the beginning. Um, as you noted, he grew up in, I say this correctly, Shamokin, Pennsylvania.
Well, he was born there. He he lived 7 years there. Then he moved to a little community south of there called Llewellyn.
Okay, okay. That whole area though, was that not like a coal mining type area? And his family was a coal mining family. What was his childhood like, and how young was Jake when he had to follow in his father's footsteps?
Well, it was a rough childhood. They had lived in Shamokin. His Shortly after Jake was born, uh, his one of his brothers was killed in a mine accident in Shamokin, and the family lived there for a few more years. Uh, then they moved to Llewellyn, and Jake had to quit school to go to work in the mine, really as a breaker boy first. And then he worked, and that's what a lot of these players did. Uh, Kovaleski was the same way. Kovaleski learned to pitch by throwing stones at a tin can, and he escaped the mines, also went into the mines at 11 or 12. And that's how a lot of these guys avoided a life in the coal mines. So he was working in the mines and playing baseball when they had time on a Saturday and Sunday. Um, and life got pretty tough for them too, because Jake's mother died shortly after that, and the family sort of went through a rough time. The Jake and his father moved in with one of the older brothers. The sisters married off. It was a difficult time financially for them, and Jake married shortly after that too.
Let's go back. You said he was a breaker boy. What is, I think that's what you called it. What is a breaker boy um, in the mining business? What does a 11-year-old boy do in a coal mine? And does he go to school, or is schooling out of the picture? Is it even important?
Well, Jake went to school as much as he could, but eventually he had to drop out full time. The breaker boys would sit as the coal was taken out of the mines. It was brought down a chute, and they had these seats that were uh, constructed over top of this trough that came down, and these breaker boys sat on these seats, and they would reach down and pick all bad the junk, the slate and everything out of the coal. And it was a long, hard. I mean, they were working 11, 12 hours a day. Their hands, all cut up and tough from it. Um, it wasn't uh, a very nice life. And all they had to look forward to really was being able to get into the mine themselves and earn a little bit more money by either running the mule train cars into the mines or actually going in and digging in the mines. And Jake was pretty ambitious, and he eventually got into the mines, and he became he made more money than he was as a breaker boy.
Hmm. How was he introduced to baseball, and how long did it take before people realized how talented a ball player he was?
Well, a lot of these players, they were playing all the time when they had, it was the only break they had. So that's what he did too. That's what he did. That's what his brothers did. He was originally a pitcher, and he was a very good pitcher. I was looking at the stats. In 1902, he was pitching for a local team out of Pottsville, Pennsylvania. That's just near Llewellyn, and he struck out 23 batters in that game. So he
Wow.
was a pretty good pitcher till he hurt his arm. Then things changed.
Yeah, so talk about that. How good a pitcher he was, and I think I read someplace that a lot of these guys start out as pitchers and then they move to different positions. And Jake obviously moved to first base. So the arm injury didn't affect his ability to hit or anything like that. Talk about that. Give us a little bit more story on that if you can.
Okay, well, Jake did hurt his arm, but he didn't move to first base immediately. He moved to third base, but the arm injury continued to be a problem, and he couldn't make the throws across the diamond. So, manager of the local team that he was with at the time said, why don't you try first base? And Jake became very good at it. He, aside from being able to hit, which he always was able to do, he seemed to have a natural talent. He was he was an exceptional defensive player, and he became even better as he worked at it.
He was discovered by Cleveland. Cleveland signed him, and then they released him a very short time later. Why? And talk about how Cleveland discovered him.
Well, Cleveland had there's an interesting story that happened. He was signed by Cleveland. He had been playing for Kane in Western Pennsylvania. It was like a minor league team. Kane folded partway through the season. They had a lot of rain, and they folded. A lot of the players went off different ways. Jake was picked up by a team, by a Marion team, and he had a pretty good season that year. He was noticed by one of the Cleveland scouts, and he invited him. They signed him, and they invited him to spring training. There's an interesting story that was told about Jake at spring training that first year that I found one of the better things. I'll just look at my notes here so I have them all. But so in 1908, first year he's with Cleveland. He goes to spring training. The manager's Napa Joy. There's two other players there working for first base, George Stovall and Bill Hitchman. And Jake's trying out for first base, and for 2 days he watches these two guys work out, and he's not out there on the field getting a chance. Now, there's a guy named Henry Edwards of the Plain Dealer at Cleveland, very well-known sports writer at the time. I've seen a lot of his work, and he asked Jake, why don't you take any work there? Now, Jake's very bashful at this point in his career, and he's very respectful. And he says, well, Mr. Stovall and Mr. Hinchman are working there all the time, and when they quit, it's time to go back to the hotel. So Edwards goes to LaJoy and tells him the story. And LaJoy says, well, what's that Busher want? Tell him if he thinks he's getting a perfume note from me, that's not going to happen. Tell him to go and push them off and tell him he wants to try it. If he's not willing to do that, I don't want him.
Wow.
Well, obviously, Jake started to assert himself. Unfortunately, he didn't make the team, so he was sent to the minors. And the same thing happened the following year. He was sent to the minors. That's when Brooklyn became aware of him. They claimed him, I believe, with the Rule 5 draft, which was existent at the time.
Wow.
And they brought him into spring training in 1910. So Cleveland actually lost out on Jake Daubert.
Did they regret it at all? Did they
I'm
ever
sure
look
they
back
did.
and say,
Some of the things that I read were that they said, he's a great ball player. We're sorry to lose him. That type of comment. Yeah.
hmm So now going back to his days, well, actually, the scout that discovered him, if I read correctly, is a guy by the name of Larry Sutton. What did he see in Jake that convinced him, wow, this is a guy that might fit us here in Brooklyn, as opposed to he didn't assert himself the right way in Cleveland, so he never got a chance with the.
Just a good overall ball player. I mean, he was good hitter, good contact hitter, good speed, and he was playing great defense already. Even though he wasn't a first baseman for very long, he picked it up very quickly.
Mhm. Yeah, and he had a good bat in his hand, like I said earlier, 264 his rookie season with Brooklyn, and 307, 308, won the batting title in 1913, hitting 350, then 329, and 301, and 316. And by the way, that 329 in 1914 was also good enough for the batting title. The year he hit 350, like you said, he won the Chalmers Award. What where did the name Chalmers Award can it come from? Can you tell us anything about that?
Well, Chalmers was an auto car company, automobiles, and they wanted some publicity. So for I think it was 4 years, the Chalmers Auto Company presented a car to the person who was voted as the MVP of each league. And Ty Cobb won it one year. Uh, Jake Jake won it. They did it for 4 years, and I guess they realized, hey, this is pretty expensive. We're going to stop it. But he was considered then the MVP of the 1913 season.
Explain the game to us from back at that time. No one was hitting 30, 40, 50 home runs a year. How does a guy who hit 350 with just two home runs and 52 ribbies win the Chalmers? What makes those stats so special? Or what was it that Jake did that made him so deserving?
Well, I think a lot of it was his team approach was important at the time. I mean, he had a great batting average. Uh, he was already sacrificing a lot. He was a great runner, great bunter. He could play great defense. Um, Everything he did about the game, he was the captain of the Brooklyn Dodgers at that young age. I mean, he was the on-field leader at a time where, the captain really meant something in those days. The captain was out there on the field, and he was like the assistant manager. So he was well respected, and overall his stats were excellent. And you know, batting wise, I think the year after in 14 he finished second in batting in the league.
Mhm. Actually, I think actually in 14, I think he won at 329. Yeah,
I meant 15. Yeah,
15. Okay, yeah.
15.
So earlier you said great character. Paint a picture for us. What kind of person was Jake? What was he like off the field? Tell us about Jake, the citizen, not the ball player.
Jake was very family oriented. He almost didn't get into professional baseball because he felt a commitment to his wife and two young children that they had very early. Uh, when he was offered the chance to go to Kane to play for Pop Kelchner, at the time he was the manager, Jake wasn't going to go. And his wife, Gertrude, they stayed up all night. She was trying to convince him, Jake, you've got to go and do this. Finally, by morning, he agreed to go. So he was committed to his family. He was committed to his brothers and his father. He took care of his younger or his one of his brother's children when his second brother was killed in the mines. He became their guardian. He became a pretty upstanding community leader, both when he was staying in Brooklyn and they wanted him to run for, I believe it was alderman
Right, right.
there. In the community that he moved to, then in Schuylkill Haven, which is south of Pottsville. That's where he lived his later years, bought a house. He was well known in the community, ran numerous businesses. Jake was, for not having much education, Jake was wealthy enough outside of baseball from his business ventures. He was extremely intelligent and he was well spoken. He knew the game of baseball inside and out, and he could dissect it. So if you go back through, I found a lot of information about Jake Daubert, more so than I did on Kovaleski, who didn't have a whole lot to say. But Daubert was quoted constantly in the newspapers and the old baseball magazine, a great, great publication in those days. And they did several cover stories on Jake about his approach and how he explained baseball. He covered World Series for newspapers and wrote about what was going on. So he was extremely well-versed and intelligent. That's where he got the name Gentleman Jake. He was such a gentleman. He wasn't the kind that went out and did a lot of carousing. He was a good, upstanding person. He's the kind of person I wish I could have met.
It's awesome. Now here's the thing I really find interesting is how smart or intelligent he was, his business acumen. And we'll get into what he did in baseball in just a little bit with those smarts. But again, when he was 11 years old, he had to go and work in the mines. So he didn't get to spend as much time, we'll say, studying or how you want to put that. So where did those smarts come from? Was he in his spare time? Was he doing things? Where did the intelligence and the business acumen come from?
I wish I knew. There is really there's no indication of where that all came from, because once he became well known in baseball, there was a lot written about Jake, but where he picked up all that intelligence. I mean, just the fact that he lacked education, you would expect that he wasn't going to be well spoken. He was. The quotes that I read from him were somebody that you would have thought, wow, he must have a college education. But I don't know where it came from. I don't know why maybe it was just a natural, intelligence that was there. But Jake was, that was Jake.
And like you said, he loved the game. He was a student of the game, very studious. He broke the game down, and like you said, he covered the game for newspapers. Um, where talk about his willingness to sacrifice himself on the field. I mean, he was really a good hitter, but he would sacrifice himself, bunts or whatever. He has the record for sacrifice bunts, as you said earlier. Where does that come from?
Well, Jake was a team player. I mean, when he was out there playing, he understood that if they had a fast runner ahead of him, got him on base, he needed to move him up, and that's what he was willing to do. That's where he saw his strength, and because he could make good contact, that's what he did. He used that. He also sacrificed a lot with his physically. Jake had a number of injuries throughout his career. Surprisingly, he played a lot of games, but he also missed a lot of games because of injuries, and they were mostly leg injuries, holes and stretches for what he called at the time Charlie horses. But he pulled a lot of. In fact, the day that he had the 6 sacrifices. He had just come back from being on the injured list.
I wonder how much that had to do with his being a first baseman. I recently did a podcast about Jim Bottomley, who was a terrific first baseman for St. Louis, and he too had a lot of injuries, and they were due to his, I think, playing first base. Talk about his defense. Earlier, you said he was a really good defensive ball player. Heck, in one game, he had 21 putouts in one game. Talk about his ability playing first base and how good he was with the glove.
Well, you know what I find amazing about that era and all, but was not just the issue of dead ball, but also the gloves that they were using. I mean, I saw a picture of Jake's glove. It looked like just a slightly larger winter glove. It wasn't the big first baseman's mitts that they use now. They said Jake could stretch farther than anybody, and he was a left-handed fielder. And he believed that that was an advantage. And Jake believed that first baseman should be left-handed. So, he was able to stretch, and he was able to get to balls that saved a lot of throws from the other infielders. Plus, to have a great fielding record at a time when they were using dirty old balls in the dead ball era. I mean, that's really, it not only was hard for a batter to be able to pick those balls up and hit them, but you had to be able to see them when they were thrown at you too at first base. So he had that ability to pick up those balls too.
Mm-hmm. Jake also played during a very interesting time, 1917, World War I, Spanish flu epidemic. It brings up memories of something not too long ago with COVID. Um, how did, I guess, first, World War I and the Spanish flu epidemic, how did that affect baseball as a whole? And in 1917, that was the first time in quite a while, since his first year playing the game, that his batting average did drop under 300. Talk about 1917, and this is going to develop into something even bigger.
Yeah, Jake was struggling. A lot of it, he often was suffering injuries, and he was trying to play through them. And it wasn't always a smart thing to do, maybe, but he was committed to the team, so he did that. 1917 at 261, but he did rebound the next year. There were injuries involved there through those years that made a difference. The Robins were struggling as a team, so
I just want everybody to know the Robins were actually
the Dodgers.
The Dodgers. So it was the Brooklyn Robins, and they became the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Well, they're named after their manager, Wilbur Robertson.
Right.
But a lot of teams did that at the time. They were nicknamed for the
Cleveland Naps.
Yep.
Brooklyn Robins. Yeah. So I'm sorry to interrupt. You were talking about the.
Well, a lot of the players, especially in 1918, wound up having to. There was an edict came down from Department of War that baseball was not exempt from serving war duties. So a lot of the players either were enlisting, and Cobb and those guys, a lot of them did. Shoeless Joe Jackson went to work in a factory somewhere, and a number of others. Jake owned a coal washery at the time in Schuylkill County, near his home in Llewellyn and Schuylkill Haven. And They used to bring the coal down from up in the upper parts down on the river, the Schuylkill River that flows on down into Philadelphia. And on these barges, a lot of the coal would fall off. And Jake ran a business drudging up the coal that fell off these, and he made pretty good money on it. So that was, and besides, by that time, Jake was not really, he was past the age where they were going to uh, draft him. So he really wasn't expected to serve in the war.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened?
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to get into this. I don't know if you wanted to get into it yet, but I was going to. What happened was they cut the season short in 1980.
Yeah. So prorated salaries.
Well, they stopped paying them. Is basically when the season was cut off. They stopped paying the players when the season ended.
Yeah. So talk about that. The prorated salaries. How that affected Jake's relationship with Charles Ebbets, who was the Dodgers owner or the Robins owner at that time, and the fact that Jake fought him for the balance of his salary.
Right. Jake, after the Federal League came through, Jake made a commitment to stay with Ebbets and the Robins. And as a reward, Charlie Ebbets signed him to a 5-year contract for, I think it was $5,000 or $6,000 a year. I don't remember, but it was like $30,000. And Charlie Ebbets, when the season was cut short, they stopped paying Jake. Now Jake said, "That's fine, but I have a contract, and there's nothing in it that says I don't get paid." So they owed him about somewhere between $1,200 and $1,500, and Jake sued him. He was very much an upstanding person as far as defending players' rights. He was one of the early officers in what became the Players Union eventually. So Jake made a stand for himself and said, I want my money." Charlie Ebbets got mad at him and traded him.
Yeah, I was going to say, how did that ultimately affect his relationship with Ebbets and the Dodgers? Because 1917 is the war, the epidemic. 1918, the season gets cut short. He only plays 108 games. He did hit 308. And then in 1919, he's playing for Cincinnati, who, as you mentioned before, were in the famous 1919 World Series against the Black Sox, and Jake won a World Series.
Yeah, Jake Ebbets was angry, and he was. I mean, they still had the reserve clause at the time, and Jake was pretty much stuck if Ebbets wasn't going to trade him. But Ebbets decided to get rid of him. Traded him to Cincinnati for a couple of players, and one of which they eventually Cincinnati actually got back. Jake was traded on February 1st of 1919. How did he respond to that? I don't think he really wanted to leave Brooklyn. He liked Brooklyn. He liked the fans. He liked the community. Jake didn't really have much of a choice at that time if he wanted to keep playing baseball, and he wasn't sure he was going to keep playing baseball. Jake by that time was fairly well off as far as had his businesses, had made some money in baseball. He was pretty smart with how he invested it and how he spent it. So Jake wasn't sure he wanted to play. In fact, early on, wasn't sure he was even going to sign with Cincinnati, but eventually he did. But he didn't forget about Charlie Ebbets and the way Charlie Ebbets treated him, because the following year, the first time that Brooklyn came to Cincinnati to play, Ebbets used to go and sit on the bench with the players in his street clothes, his suit and tie and all. And Jake knew that he wasn't supposed to do that. So he complained to the umpire, and they threw him off the bench. Jake, Jake sort of got a bit of a back at Charlie Ebbets.
Well, and not only did he get back at him that way, he also got back at him with how well he played for Cincinnati. In his 6 years with the Reds, he hit 303, and that included a 1922 season in which he hit 336 and led the National League with a career high 22 triples. Talk about his days with Cincinnati and just how good he was for the Reds. He really didn't miss a beat.
No, he had a couple of he had one or two down years with Cincinnati. A lot of it had to do with, again, injuries, but a lot of people thought he was getting old and he wasn't going to be able to continue to play. When the 1922 season, now remember, by now, the dead ball era is over. It ended in 1920 when they outlawed the spitball. Jake, in that season, was named captain of the Reds. He replaced Tiny Grow, who had been traded. And he went on to lead the league in 22 with 22 triples. He hit a career high 12 home runs, had 205 hits, 114 runs, 66 RBIs. Remember, he's batting second.
And he's 38 years old.
And he's 38. And he had a 22-game hitting streak. Even after he started the season very slowly, 0 for 25. In 700 plate appearances, he struck out 21 times in 700 plate appearances.
There's guys in the game today that strike out 21 times in a week.
Oh, we know who they are. Yeah. And and the other thing is, he had his career best fielding percentage at .994. And this was one of the most impressive stats. He played in all 156 games. He missed 14 innings the entire season.
38 years old.
38 years old.
Harry, can you believe I just read an article that baseball is considering, there's talk that there's management in baseball is now considering going the NBA route of load management. We're talking baseball.
I don't know. You have to wonder.
Yeah, and Jake Daubert, at the age of 38, played 156 games and missed all of 14 innings the entire year. Load management. Give me a break.
Yeah, I know. I agree with you.
Well, you referred to it earlier. One of his biggest contributions to the game was his involvement in basically unionizing baseball. Sure, the union didn't come along for decades, but he got the players together, right? He was able to do something to help the players band together and stick together at what was still probably a pretty controversial time, as the Federal League had disappeared, but there was still a lot going on. Talk about that and his role in getting the players together to make a stand and what his fellow ball players thought of him.
Well, I think a lot of the other players looked at Jake as a leader. They respected him a lot. I don't know that the union at that time was obviously it was just new. It wasn't the Players Association as it was not didn't have a lot of strength, but there were a number of the big names, Mathewson and Cobb and some others that had become involved with it. So the owners had to at least listen to them. So, one of the early events that took place was at one of the league meetings, and they presented a series of petitions that they wanted them to look, the owners to look at, and they did, and when they were things like when they were going to suspend a player, they had to give them a reason for it. They had to explain it. There were a number of things. They didn't approve them all, but they approved some of them. So they were making some progress. Unfortunately, it started to fall apart, and maybe it was because the some of the players that were making more money didn't really want to lose that money, because baseball was tough at that time to make, even so, to make a living. Players like Jake, they had to, as soon as the season was over, they went on these barnstorming tours, and the reason was they had to make money on the side for these players. I mean, he took a group of players early on in his career with Brooklyn to Cuba for
Wow.
a trip, and they used to go all over the place, and they would go into these small communities, and because Jake was the one that ran these trips, he would take them to his hometown communities, little places like Llewellyn and Minersville and Schuylkill Haven. And in those places, they would play a local team. So they'd have these professional baseball players coming in and playing a local team. So, Jake's involvement with the union, it eventually faded away for a number of years, but came back, and I'm not sure that it didn't have a negative effect on Jake in the long run, because the owners didn't appreciate it, and people like Charlie Ebbets definitely didn't appreciate it. So, I don't know what kind of impact it had on Jake's legacy and his eventual um, lack of being considered for the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I wanted to get to the Hall of Fame real quick because obviously he did not make the Hall of Fame. And how much of that do you also attribute possibly to the fact that he got such a late start? He didn't start playing, or he didn't make it to the majors until he was 26 years old. So many others played when they were significantly younger. I'd say he probably missed the potential of about 6 seasons of his youth. How much of that do you think affected his overall career stats, I guess? But why such the late start?
Well, a lot of it was responsibilities at home. Uh, it might have had some impact on it, but keep in mind, Jake was still playing at age 40, so he played 15 years, and he was playing at a high level in his late 30s. So I don't know that the late start had a real negative.
I know that back then they didn't look at numbers the way we look at them today, but I'm figuring if he even got into the game when he was 22, so 22, 3, 4, 5, 4 years, and you could say some of those 4 years he would have probably broken through and played a fair amount. He still had, what, over 2,300 hits for his career. It had a career batting average of 303. So over the course of 4 years, you would think he could have come close to another 700 hits and possibly challenged that 3,000 mark. Again, 3,000 hits back then was not looked at the same way we look at 3,000 hits today. But the Veterans Committee, or, maybe at that time, when the Hall of Fame came about, they would have looked back and said, oh my God, this guy, Jake Daubert, should be in the Hall.
Well, I think at that time, one of the things that I have come to believe that hurt Jake quite a bit in his consideration for the Hall of Fame was he died in when he was 40 years old in 1924. He was still playing a lot of those players that were so good were still playing after that. Ruth and Cobb and all those guys. It was another 12 years till the Hall of Fame was established after Jake died. I think Jake just fell out of the spotlight, and people, did it have anything to do with his union issues? I don't know. Did it have anything to do with, his disagreement with owners, who had a lot of influence? Maybe. Also, it's just, timing was bad. And Jake, well, it's just a shame that, through the years, he wasn't ever given any more consideration after that.
Yeah, 1924, at the age of 40, he played 102 games. By this time, his career is winding down. I mean, he did hit 281, though. But the end was tragic. Talk about the end. 1924 and what happened.
In 1924, Jake was still playing, and he was playing fairly well yet. He wasn't the player he was a couple of years prior, but he was still playing fairly well. But in early in the season, he was beaned at the plate. It was one of 8 beanings he took during his career. He had trouble throughout the rest of the season with headaches, being able to see straight. Jake kept wanting to play. He shouldn't have. He should have stopped. They sent him home at one point. They were in Philadelphia. They sent him home. He didn't want any parts of not being with the team. Jake was not feeling well at all. So they left Philadelphia. The team left Philadelphia. Jake had been at home. He decided, I'm not going to just abandon my team. So and his quote was, I don't want people to think I'm a staller. So he left home, as sick as he was, and traveled to meet the team. I don't think it was in Cincinnati, but it was somewhere. It was somewhere in that area. They went. Eventually, he wound up in Cincinnati, and Jake was very sick. He wound up in the hospital. When he got to the hospital, he was still having these effects from the beanings. He couldn't sleep. He was having pains in his stomach. They took him in for surgery, and they drained his gallbladder and took out his appendix because they thought that was what the problem was. Turns out it wasn't. Even though he died, as a result of that while he was in the hospital.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The result on the death certificate was acute gastric dilatation and acute appendicitis. Turns out neither one was the cause of death. Jake, they found out later, died from hereditary spherocytic anemia. It's
Say that 3 times fast.
It's a genetic disease that can be treated and you can go on living if they remove the spleen and the gallbladder.
Did they know that at that
They
time?
did not.
That's today that you can go on living, but back
Correct.
then they didn't have that technology.
They didn't have that knowledge at the time. And what's interesting is in the course of doing the research and writing my book, I was able to track down 2 of his great-grandchildren, Jake Daubert and Jill Malone Daubert, brother and sister, who lived down in Florida. They both had this genetic
Wow.
condition, and that they were treated for it.
Wow.
So it's something that you just wonder what Jake's life would have been like if medical tech knowledge at the time would have been able to find that out. But the impact of Jake on the game, it was interesting because the day that he died was they were playing the World Series, Game 6 of the World Series on October 9th. And players from the New York Giants and the Washington Nationals, they gathered at home plate to pay tribute before the game to Jake's memory. And the fans stood in silence for more than the requested minute that they wanted in memory of Jake. It was quite a tribute. Big service in Cincinnati, took the body home to Schuylkill Haven. He's buried in a cemetery in Pottsville. They had a big service there. A lot of big names that showed up at the funeral. He was well respected.
Yeah, I mean, he finished his career with a 303 batting average. When he left the game, he was seventh all time in hits, ninth in triples, and top 10 in many other categories, especially fielding categories. And we already talked about his game when it came to sacrifices. How should Jake Daubert be remembered? What's his legacy?
Well, if I had my way, it would be being put into the Hall of Fame by the Historical Overview Committee. So much to the fact that I put a package together and submitted it to the Hall of Fame.
And you did that. I just want to say, you did that after you wrote the book. You didn't go into the book with the intention of saying, I'm going to get this guy elected to the Hall of Fame or make a case for him. That came after all your research while you were writing your book, did it not?
Once I realized how good this guy was, and once I did comparisons with all the players of his era, that including a number that are in the Hall of Fame, Frank Chance, Beckley, Kelly, all those guys that are in the Hall of Fame that played first base, and Jake was on par with most of them. I mean, Frank Chance, Jake's equal or better in every area to Frank Chance, and Chance is in the Hall of Fame. So yeah, it was beginning of March. This book came out last fall. I was working with his two great grandchildren, and I said, I think should be in the Hall of Fame, and this is the 100th anniversary of his death. It would be an appropriate time to try to get him considered for the Hall of Fame. So they asked me to go ahead and pursue it. They had I had all the information, so I did. So I sent the letter in the package, all the comparisons to all these other players of his time, first baseman and other great hitters, and I don't know where it's going to go. I would love that to be the legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Jake deserves it. It wasn't just the National Baseball Hall of Fame that Jake was ignored from. The Pennsylvania Sports Hall of Fame had never put Jake in.
Hmm.
Well, that was submitted also. Jake's going into the Pennsylvania Sports Hall of Fame in November.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
Yeah,
That's
so
awesome.
that's really quite an accomplishment, and we're happy. His great grandchildren were instrumental in pushing to get that done. So we're going to be at that, and we're going to get that done. And maybe next year will be a big year. Maybe because they'll consider it, and if he were selected to be inducted into the Hall of Fame by this historical committee, it would be in 2025.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Harry, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with us on Sports Forgotten Heroes. You certainly know your subject matter. I wish you all the best with the book about Jake. I thought this was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I love talking about him because I just I just admire the guy. It's like he was an incredible person.
There are so many players worthy of Hall of Fame induction whom time has forgotten. Players who finished their careers long before the Hall of Fame was a thing. Daubert probably falls into that category. He was one of the best of his time. And like I said, he was seventh all time in hits when his career came to an abrupt and tragic end. He had a .303 career batting average, an MVP, and he was as good as anyone in the field, especially at first base. Thanks again to Harry Deitz for joining, and thanks to all of you for listening. We'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.